I'm Mike, the storyteller of Bigfoot Story Hidden. Tonight, we are going to follow Caleb Mercer, a 37-year-old wildlife videographer living in Bozeman, Montana. Something made him leave the crazy mountains before sunrise. Before we begin, I want to make it clear that this story is a storytelling piece inspired by Bigfoot folklore and long-standing legends around the forests and mountains of North America. Some images, sounds, or video clips used in this episode were created with AI and digital tools to recreate the mood of the story, not as real investigative footage or a real-life documentary. But honestly, the thing that haunted me in this story was not the video Caleb captured. It was the detail he told about the wolves. According to Caleb Mercer, right before that creature stepped out of the snow-covered pine forest, the entire wolf pack backed away together in silence, as if they knew what was coming far better than any human could. And that is why I never forgot this story. I came to the area north of Livingston in late September, hoping to make a little extra money before winter. My job was not anything special. I flew drones, filmed wildlife footage, and sold it to a few podcasts and small channels that made nature content. In recent years, people seem to enjoy watching wolves hunt elk more than watching the news, so if I caught a good scene, I could make enough to pay off the loan on my old Tacoma and save a little for my grandfather's cabin. I still kept the key to that cabin in my jacket pocket, even though the bank had posted a warning notice on it the summer before. My father used to say a man should hold on to one place that makes him want to come back. For me, that place was the cabin beside the Boulder River, where I learned how to start a fire and tie a fishing line before I was even old enough to drive. I set up camp near an abandoned logging road that led into the foothills of the Crazy Mountains. The place was remote enough that I would not run into other hunters, but it still had enough GPS signal for the drone. That afternoon was colder than the forecast had said. Wind moved along the mountainside, carrying the smell of wet soil, pine resin, and yellow grass dying before the snow season. I sat on the bed of the truck, opened my father's old notebook, and wrote down the temperature, wind speed, and direction of the elk herd I had just seen about half a mile away. I did it almost by reflex. Some people might find that funny, but my father used to believe nature always warned you before something happened, through small changes. He was not the kind of man who believed in mystical things. He had simply lived in the woods long enough to learn how to pay attention. I launched the drone as the sun was almost disappearing behind the fir trees. The thermal camera showed bright moving shapes down in the valley. 2 elk were crossing a shallow marsh, and farther west there was a pack of gray wolves. My heart started beating faster as soon as I saw them. Footage of wolves hunting as a pack always sold well, especially at the start of the cold season, when their behavior changed more. I kept the drone at a moderate height and let it follow the wolves. 6 of them moved in a loose line, the distance between each one so even it looked like they had practiced it for years. I had tracked wolves in Wyoming and Idaho before, but there was still something captivating about watching a predator pack work together in silence. Around 8 in the evening, the sky darkened so fast that I had to turn on the second screen on my controller. Cold mist started crawling over the low ground. I heard ravens somewhere far away, and then everything slowly sank into silence. The wolves slowed as they entered thicker trees. I thought they had caught the scent of elk. The lead wolf moved a few steps ahead, its body low, its ears upright. I leaned in, focusing on the thermal screen, and then realized all 6 wolves suddenly stopped at the same time. I had watched hundreds of hours of wildlife footage, and it was rare for anything to catch my attention like that. They did not change direction. They did not spread out. They only stood still, eyes fixed on the same point in the forest. I took off my headphones to listen around me. There were no insects anymore. Even the wind had dropped, as if the whole forest had just held its breath. I felt the skin on the back of my neck go cold, even though I was wearing a thick jacket. A howl rose from the mountainside across the valley. The sound was long, deep, and farther reaching than a normal wolf howl. I waited for the pack on the screen to respond, but none of them did. They only stood there, so still they looked like stone statues. One wolf stepped back half a pace and tucked its tail tightly under its belly. I had never seen wolves do that unless they were injured or facing something that shook the entire pack. I zoomed the thermal camera toward the stretch of forest they were staring at. At first I thought it was an image error, because a large white heat mass stood between the tree trunks. It was too tall to be an elk, and too wide to be a person. I adjusted the focus several times. The shape remained still. Its shoulders were unusually broad, almost level with the young tree trunk beside it. Its upper body leaned slightly forward, and its arms were so long that the body proportions looked completely wrong. I thought of a bear right away, but no bear would stand that motionless in front of a wolf pack for that long. I tried to stay calm by explaining everything in the most reasonable way possible. Maybe it was only a tree trunk holding heat. Maybe the thermal camera was reading wrong because of the cold mist. I even considered the chance that another hunter was wearing some special thermal gear. But when the lead wolf stepped forward a few paces, that heat mass shifted very slightly to the left. That one small movement was enough to make the entire pack step back at the same time. I remembered a story I had heard in a bar in Livingston the year before. An old hunter said there were a few valleys in the crazy mountains where even wolves did not stay too long. At the time, I thought he was just trying to scare tourists. Now, sitting alone in the dark forest, that memory started to feel a lot more uncomfortable. I moved the drone a few yards closer. The screen flickered slightly, then stabilized again. Now I could see the head of the creature more clearly. It did not have a clear neck like a human. Its shoulders rose straight into the head, forming one heavy block. The fur around its arms reflected less heat than the body, as if it was wet or covered in mud. What unsettled me most was not its size, but the way it stayed completely silent. An animal that big should have made some kind of sound standing in a dry forest, but I heard nothing except my own breathing. Then the second howl rang out. This one came from very close enough that I felt it in my chest before I fully understood what I was hearing. It did not sound like a wolf. A wolf howl is usually high and rhythmic, but this sound was low, long, and vibrating, like metal being dragged across stone. I spun around by reflex. Behind me, there was only black pine forest and the shape of my Tacoma parked beside the dirt road. I stood too quickly and almost dropped the controller. For a few seconds, I just stared at the darkness between the tree trunks. The wind shifted and brought the smell of wet fur and something sharp, like old river mud. I told myself maybe the sound had echoed up from the valley. I tried to believe that. But then a large branch snapped somewhere behind me, much closer than the safe distance I wanted. I recalled the drone immediately. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost pushed the wrong control stick. The screen shook hard as the drone turned back. In the brief moment before the angle was lost, I saw that the white heat mass was no longer where it had been. It was standing closer to the edge of the forest, facing straight toward me. I stuffed the controller into my bag and grabbed the tripod. Footsteps sounded somewhere to the right of the dirt road. Not fast, not rushed, just heavy and steady. I started running without even locking the truck bed. The headlamp on my forehead bounced with each breath. Sagebrush scraped against my pants as I rushed down the small slope toward the old Forest Service cabin I had seen on the map. While running, I still held the handheld camera by professional instinct. The footage from that moment must have been a terrible mess, but I remember pointing the lens toward the forest several times. Between the dark trunks, a very tall black shape moved parallel to me. I could not see its full body. I only saw wide shoulders and long arms flashing between the pines. At one point, the light swept over a bush and caught two low, glowing points, like animal eyes, but far higher from the ground than wolf eyes should have been. I heard the wolves howling again behind me, this time shorter and more urgent. It no longer sounded like hunting. It sounded like a warning. I ran so hard my lungs burned. An old memory from when I slipped into a rock cut at 16 suddenly came back. I had lain down there for almost 3 hours before I managed to crawl out. The one thing I remembered clearly from that night was the feeling of darkness pressing close against my body. That same feeling returned completely. The cabin sat behind a row of fallen trees, its roof slanted and its windows covered in thick dust. I rushed to the door and yanked it open. The hinges screamed so loudly I almost wanted to curse. Inside, it was cold and smelled of rotten wood. I slammed the door and dragged an old table across it. My heart was pounding so hard, my ears rang for several seconds. I turned off the flashlight and stood still in the dark, listening. At first, there was only wind sliding through gaps in the wood. Then I heard a very soft sound outside, like slow footsteps circling the cabin. The wooden floor beneath my boots felt stiff with cold. I gripped the hunting knife at my hip, even though I knew that if whatever was outside was really as large as what I had seen, that knife would not help at all. About 10 minutes later, everything went quiet again. I still did not dare go outside. I took the laptop from my backpack and opened the footage I had just filmed. The low battery made the screen darker than usual. I scrubbed through the shaky parts until the frame stopped on one clearer image a few seconds before I ran. The creature stood among the wolves, like a stone pillar covered in wet fur. Dark gray fur clung around its shoulders and arms. Both arms hung almost to the knees. Its upper body was too wide for any bear I had ever seen. It was not looking at the wolves. It was looking straight toward the camera. I zoomed in until the pixels started breaking apart. The feeling in my stomach then was not ordinary fear. It was like the moment when you realize something you have always considered impossible may have been standing less than 100 yards away from you. I sat alone in that freezing cabin, listening to wind whistle through the wall cracks, and trying to convince myself that by morning everything would have a more reasonable explanation. But deep in my head, I knew I would not sleep that night, because something out there in the forest had seen me before I even realized it existed. I sat with my back against the cabin wall for nearly another hour, not daring to turn on the light. Now and then, I looked toward the dusty window, as if waiting for some huge hand to appear outside the fogged glass. The handheld radio gave off only weak static, then died completely. I tried calling a friend in Bozeman, but my phone had no signal. As the night got deeper, the temperature dropped fast. My breath appeared as thin white streaks in the darkness. I opened the footage again and started writing down every detail in my notebook, the way my father used to do when tracking deer in snow. The time the wolf pack appeared, the wind direction, the estimated distance between me and the creature. I tried to turn everything into data because data makes people feel safer. Even so, every time I froze the video on that blurred face, I had the feeling the creature had not been surprised by the camera at all. It stood there, as if it had known from the start that I would come to this valley, fly the drone over that forest, and eventually run away from that place, like every other animal. Outside, wind moved through the pines in a low, deep sound, almost like the howl I still could not forget. I barely slept in the cabin that night. Every time I dozed for a few minutes, I jerked awake, thinking I had heard footsteps outside the wooden wall. Near dawn, the wind weakened, and the forest became so quiet I could hear the ticking of my wristwatch. When the eastern sky began to lighten, I finally felt calm enough to push the table away from the door and step outside. The cold air cut into my face like ice water. Thin mist covered the ground, and the black pine trunks around the cabin made the place look like a small island in a sea of dark trees. I stood still for a few seconds, watching the area before walking back toward the truck. There was no sign that whatever I had heard the night before was still nearby. No sound, no strange smell, only soft mud left by the night mist on the dirt road. I was about to get in the truck and leave the mountains immediately, but then I saw the first footprint beside a sagebrush clump less than 20 feet from the cabin. It was pressed deep into the mud, longer than any human footprint I had ever seen in the woods. I knelt and placed my hand beside it for comparison. It was around 17 inches long, wide in the front, narrower at the heel, with 5 toes so clear that my throat went dry. A bear standing on its hind legs can leave strange shapes in soft ground, but this print was completely different. It looked like something walking on 2 feet with its whole weight driving into each step. I took photos with my phone, then used a tape measure to check the depth of the print. The ground there was firmer than it looked, yet the track sank almost 3 inches. I stepped hard beside it to compare. My boot left only a shallow mark. A cold feeling ran down my spine when I thought about how much weight it would take to make that kind of pressure. I stood and looked toward the forest where the footprints disappeared. Morning light made everything less frightening than the night before, but it did not erase the memory of the dark shape standing among the wolves. I drove down to Livingston around 8 in the morning. The small town was still quiet, with only a few pickups parked in front of the diner near the main road. The smell of coffee and bacon reminded me that I had not eaten anything since the previous evening. I sat at the counter, ordered eggs and black coffee, and opened my laptop to watch the footage again. The more I watched, the more uncomfortable I felt, because that creature did not look like anything I knew. It was too tall to be a man in hunting clothes, but its movement did not look like a bear. I had paused on the moment the wolves backed away, when an older man sitting a few seats away glanced at my screen. He wore a faded red flannel shirt and an old cap with the logo of some ranch I did not recognize. I was about to close the laptop, but he had already seen the main frame. He did not ask what I was watching. He only looked at it for a long time, then slowly sipped his coffee. After almost half a minute of silence, he told me to turn the video off. I did it almost by reflex. He introduced himself as Walter Grin. He said he used to work as a tracker for a few ranches around Livingston and had helped find lost cattle in the mountains to the north. I thought he would laugh in my face, or say the thing in the video was just a bear, but Walter did not seem surprised at all. That made me even more uneasy than mockery would have. He asked where I had filmed the footage. I did not want to give the exact place, so I only said somewhere near the Crazy Mountains. Walter nodded very slowly, like he had already guessed. He did not use the word Bigfoot, or any name connected to legends. He only looked out the fogged window and said if the wolves were avoiding that thing, then I should not go back into that valley at night. The sentence sounded normal, but the way he said it made it feel more like a warning than a comment. I asked if he had ever seen anything similar. Walter stayed silent for a few seconds before standing to pay for his coffee. Before leaving the diner, he only said there were some places in the mountains that were better left alone. I remained seated by myself, feeling as if I had just missed half of the story. I should have driven back to Bozeman right then. Part of me truly wanted to. I had footage strange enough to sell to a podcast for good money. I also did not like feeling pulled into online cryptid stories. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I thought about the wolves' reaction. I grew up around hunters and spent years filming wildlife. I knew wolves did not behave like that unless they sensed a threat much greater than themselves. After breakfast, I went to the small town library and spent almost 2 hours searching old articles in the local database. At first, there was nothing interesting except missing livestock and bear damage reports at campsites. But when I widened the search to areas around the foothills of the Crazy Mountains, a few details started repeating in a way that was hard to ignore. In 2004, 2 wolves were found dead near a canyon north of Livingston. The ranger report said their ribs had been broken, but they had barely been eaten. Another article talked about hunting dogs running away all at once from an elk hunter's camp at the start of the snow season. Someone claimed they heard loud wood knocks in the middle of the night, but found no one nearby. The more I read, the more a strange pattern appeared inside those scattered reports. Animals left the area before something happened. I closed the laptop and sat looking out at the parking lot for a long while. The sky was turning gray as snow clouds dropped low around the mountains. I knew I was facing a choice that the logical part of me hated: leave and treat everything as one strange experience, or go back to find out what truly lived in that valley. In the end, I went back to the outdoor store near the main road and bought extra batteries, an audio recorder, and an infrared light for the drone. I told myself I only needed a few more hours of daytime footage to prove the creature was a bear or some kind of mistake. People in my line of work cling to logic, because if you let imagination take over, you start seeing things that are not there behind every tree. By late afternoon, I drove back up into the mountains. The first snow of the season began falling in small flakes that blew sideways across the windshield. The dirt road was slicker than before, and there were no vehicles except mine. The deeper I drove into the forest, the heavier the quiet became. I no longer heard birds. Even the ravens from yesterday had disappeared. I set up the equipment near the old spot, but this time I chose a higher patch of ground to watch the valley. The cold wind made my fingers stiff as I prepared the drone. The sun had not fully set when I heard the first knock echo from deep in the forest. The sound was loud, dry, and even, like someone hitting a hollow tree trunk with a heavy piece of wood. I stood still and listened, but the sound did not repeat right away. Maybe it was a branch breaking from the cold. I tried to think that as I sent the drone upward. The thermal camera swept over pine canopies covered in thin snow. At first, there were only a few deer moving near the creek edge. Then the image flickered slightly and showed the same wolf pack I had seen the night before. They stood on a low slope, tails lowered, all facing the same small patch of trees. I brought the drone lower. None of them were hunting. None of them made a sound. One young wolf stepped forward a few paces, then suddenly whined softly before retreating behind the pack. The whole pack kept its distance from that area of trees, as if an invisible border blocked them. My heart beat faster as I remembered the image from the night before. Wind started blowing harder, throwing snow across the thermal screen in white streaks. Then the creature appeared. It stepped out between two pines with almost no wasted movement. In thermal view, its body showed as a large, bright shape nearly 8 feet tall. The fur around its shoulders and arms appeared patchy gray and silver, as if covered with dried mud. Its back curved slightly forward, and its arms hung almost to the knees. What made it hard to look away was how completely calm it stood before the wolves. A bear would roar or move to threaten them, but this creature only stood there, watching. The wolves lowered their bodies even more. I clearly saw one turn its head as if it wanted to run, but it hesitated because the lead wolf had not moved yet. That moment made me realize I was looking at something even the most effective predator species in these mountains did not want to face. One wolf suddenly lunged forward. I do not know whether it panicked or tried to defend territory. What happened next was so fast I could barely follow it. The creature twisted sideways with a speed that made no sense for its size. I did not clearly see the strike. I only saw the wolf flung hard to the side before slamming into the base of a tree. The whole pack scattered instantly in chaos. A few ran down into the valley while others shot back up the snowy slope. I dropped the controller when I tried to stand. The drone screen shook badly because my hands were trembling so much. The creature did not chase the wolves. It only lifted its head and looked upward, directly toward the drone, flying almost 200 feet above the ground. In that second, I had the very clear feeling that it knew it was being watched. Not the way an animal notices a strange sound. It looked straight into the camera, as if it understood exactly what was flying above it. A low sound came through the drone microphone. It was not loud, but it was enough to make the video signal distort into strong white lines. I immediately pulled the drone back toward me. Snow was falling harder now, and wind whipped through the trees in a long hiss. While packing the equipment, I kept glancing toward the forest, because the feeling of being watched had returned even stronger than the night before. I no longer cared whether the footage could sell. The only thing in my mind was the distance between me and whatever was standing somewhere beyond those snow-covered pines. When the drone landed on the ground beside the truck, I realized my hands were freezing cold and soaked with sweat at the same time. I threw all the equipment into the truck bed so fast I dropped my notebook into the mud. As I bent to pick it up, I heard the wood knocking again from deep in the forest, this time much closer. 3 knocks in a row, slow and heavy, echoed across the snow-covered valley like a signal I could not understand. I stood frozen for several seconds and looked at the dark trees on the other side of the road. Nothing moved between the trunks, but I knew very clearly that something was still there, watching me as the Montana sky sank into early winter darkness. I left the mountains before the sky went fully dark, but the feeling of being watched followed me the whole way down to Livingston. Snow covered the windshield, and the wood knocks I had heard that afternoon kept repeating in my head with the rhythm of the wipers. I rented a small room behind an old motel near the highway and spent almost the whole night checking the footage again. My laptop grew hot after hours of rewinding and replaying the thermal videos. I began noticing a detail I had missed before because I had been too focused on the creature. Every time it appeared in the frame, the environmental sound vanished for a few seconds before that. No wind, no branches. Even the background sound that always exists in the forest suddenly became empty, as if someone had pulled all sound out of the space. At first, I thought the microphone had failed because of the low temperature, but it happened on both the drone and the handheld camera. I sat with my back against the bed frame, my eyes burning from lack of sleep, and started to feel that the scariest thing was no longer the creature's shape. What unsettled me was the sense that every familiar rule of the forest changed around it. I tried cleaning the audio with editing software, but got only warped, unpleasant layers of sound, like a freight train echoing through a tunnel. Near 3 in the morning, I paused on a short clip before the wolves fled. One of them was looking straight toward my camera, instead of at the creature in the forest. That moment gave me chills, because it looked as if the animal had realized there was another threat present in the valley. I slept less than 2 hours before waking to the sound of trucks passing outside the motel. My whole body felt heavy as lead. I went down to the lobby for coffee, then sat in the truck for almost half an hour just thinking about what to do next. Every reasonable option pointed to leaving Montana for a few days, sending the footage to a client, and forgetting the night in that valley. But every time I thought about the look in the wolves' eyes, I felt I could not put this down yet. I needed someone who understood animal behavior better than I did to look at the video. Around noon, I called Dana Holloway, a wildlife biologist who had appeared in a podcast I worked with the year before. Dana studied wolf behavior around Yellowstone and was famously impatient with internet cryptid stories. I knew that if she saw something truly abnormal, at least I would have an objective opinion. We met that same afternoon at a small coffee shop near Bozeman. Dana was small, with her hair tied back neatly, and she always carried a waterproof notebook stuffed with notes. She listened to very little of my explanation, and mostly just let me play the footage so she could observe it herself. I noticed Dana did not react much when the creature appeared. Instead, she rewound the moment when the wolves all stopped together several times. The more she watched, the tighter her expression became. Dana explained that wolves rarely give up hunting territory like that. They may avoid bears or mountain lions for a short time, but the collective reaction in the footage looked like the whole pack had encountered an unidentified apex threat. I asked if an unusually large bear could cause that. Dana shook her head immediately. She said that even when facing a full-grown grizzly, wolves usually keep formation and try to pressure the animal to leave. In my video, they were truly afraid. That answer made the small coffee shop feel several degrees colder to me. Dana asked me exactly what I had seen on site. I told her about the howl, the footprints, and the way the forest went silent before the creature appeared, but I did not tell her all of my fear. I did not want to hear my own mouth say that I had run away from something I could not even name. Dana asked to hear the raw data from the audio recorder. We sat for almost 2 hours with headphones plugged into the laptop. In one very short section, right before the wolves scattered, there was a low sound stretching underneath the whole layer of background noise. Dana frowned and wrote something in her notebook. She did not give a conclusion, but I could see that her first skepticism had faded a lot. Finally, Dana suggested going back to the valley with me the next day to collect more data. She said if there was a large, unidentified animal affecting wolf behavior, she wanted to see it for herself. We prepared carefully for that trip. Dana brought low-frequency audio equipment, an environmental temperature meter, and several motion sensors used in wildlife research. I added more batteries, a backup drone, and headlights for the truck. The next morning, the sky was heavy gray, like lead. Snow fell thicker than on the previous days, and the clouds were so low they almost covered the slopes of the crazy mountains. On the drive in, Dana barely spoke. She only asked a few questions about where I had seen the footprints and where the wolf pack had appeared last. I realized I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, even though the road behind us was completely empty. The anxiety began returning as soon as we left the main road and entered the old logging area. When we reached the valley, Dana got out to check the fresh snow. She found several wolf tracks cutting across the dirt road, but all of them were leading away from the deeper forest. That made her stay silent for a while. We set up a temporary camp on a low rise near the place where I had flown the drone before. The air was so cold that our breath turned into thick white clouds around our faces. While Dana installed the sound sensors, I walked along the forest edge, looking for a good drone angle. I found several long silver-gray hairs caught on the torn bark of a pine tree. They were rougher and stiffer than bear hair I had handled before. Dana used tweezers to place them into a sealed bag, then smelled around the tree trunk. She said there was a very strong odor, like wet soil mixed with animal remains left too long in the rain. That smell immediately reminded me of the wind I had breathed in when I heard the howl behind me on the first night. Darkness came quickly, because snow clouds covered the valley. We lit a small gas stove beside the tent, but neither of us really felt like eating. Around 9 that night, I started hearing soft footsteps around the camp. I could not tell the direction, just the sound of snow compressing very slowly, then vanishing before I could locate it. Dana heard it too, because she stopped mid-sentence and looked up into the forest. We turned off the tent lights so we could see better. The darkness between the pines was so thick it looked like a black wall built around the camp. For a long while, nothing happened. Then 3 loud knocks rang out from the east side of the valley. The sound was dry and deep enough that I felt it in my chest. Dana looked in that direction for several seconds before turning toward me. She no longer had the calm look of a scientist. Less than a minute later, another string of knocks answered from farther away on the other side of the slope. I had never heard any animal create a sound with that kind of rhythm. The wind almost died after the final knock. We sat silently beside the dim gas stove until Dana quietly said this was starting to go far beyond normal wolf behavior research. I checked the handheld thermal camera and slowly swept it across the forest. At first, only cold tree trunks appeared dark on the screen. Then a few small heat points appeared among the low brush. The wolf pack was moving around the camp. They were not coming in like predators stalking humans. The whole pack was only circling in a tense state, constantly staring toward the forest behind me. One stood less than 50 feet from the tent, its fur raised along its spine, making a very low growl. I had never seen wolves focus on one direction for so long without either running or attacking. Dana whispered that they were waiting for something. That sentence tightened my stomach. I lifted the thermal camera higher, and then I saw it. The creature stood between 2 large pines about 40 feet from camp. On the thermal screen, its body glowed bright against the freezing forest. It was completely motionless. No arm movement, no head tilt. It only stood there looking toward the tent as if it had been there long before we noticed. My heartbeat was so hard that my hands could barely hold the camera steady. Dana stood beside me and said nothing for several seconds. Then she whispered that it knew we were there. Those words made the air around the camp feel thick. I realized the creature did not have the posture of a predator. It was not crouching low or coming forward like a bear preparing to attack. What I felt from it was more like a silent warning, a very clear message that we had gone too far into a place that did not belong to us. The wolves began to withdraw one by one. None of them turned their backs completely to the creature until they were far enough away. I heard snow crunching as they disappeared between the tree trunks. In that brief moment, the whole forest fell into absolute silence. Then the most terrifying sound I had ever heard in my life rose from somewhere behind the creature. It was not like a howl, and it was not like the roar of any animal I knew. The sound stretched and broke into many low, vibrating layers that made my chest ache as if it were being squeezed. Dana stepped back once and immediately started crying, the kind of pure, instinctive reaction the body has when the pressure becomes too much. The creature in front of us suddenly slammed its hand against the tree beside it. The impact thundered through the valley like a rifle shot in the night. I could not think of anything anymore except getting out of that place immediately. I grabbed Dana's hand and pulled her toward the truck. The snow was ankle-deep and made it much harder to move than I expected. As we ran, I heard something very large moving parallel to us in the forest on the right. The pine trunks shook slightly whenever it passed between them. I only caught huge patches of darkness appearing and disappearing through the blowing snow. Dana was gasping behind me, and I nearly slipped twice on the frozen dirt road. When we reached the truck, I looked back just as the headlights swept across the forest. For less than a second, I clearly saw the hunched back covered in black silver fur and amber reflecting eyes standing between the trees. Its height made everything around it look distorted, like the perspective was wrong in a photograph. I opened the door, pushed Dana into the passenger seat, and ran to the driver's side. The Tacoma did not start right away. The engine only coughed a few times, while outside the glass, the forest darkness seemed to move closer. I turned the key again so hard I nearly snapped it. The engine finally roared to life just as I heard a large branch break behind the truck. I hit the gas so hard the rear wheels slid sideways on the snow before catching the road again. We rushed down the logging road in total silence. Dana held her arms tight against her chest, her face pale under the dashboard lights. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, even though I did not want to see anything behind us. Snow kept falling thickly, swallowing the headlights and turning the road into a cold, white tunnel. It took almost 20 minutes before I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles hurt. At that moment, I had only one thought left in my mind. Whatever lived in that valley was not just a stray animal or a harmless legend in the Montana woods. It understood how to make every other living thing stay away from its territory. And that night, I was certain that if it had truly wanted us to stay, neither Dana nor I would ever have left that forest. Dana and I barely spoke the whole way out of the mountains that night. The tires grinding over hard snow and the wind striking the Tacoma were the only sounds inside the cab. I felt that if I opened my mouth, everything that had just happened would become more real than I could handle. Dana sat turned toward the window, holding the recorder so tightly her knuckles were white. When the lights of Livingston appeared in the distance, I finally realized I had been driving in a locked-up state for nearly an hour. We stopped at the old motel where I had rented the room the day before. Snow kept falling outside the parking lot, covering the roofs of old pickups and the blinking neon sign by the front office. Dana followed me to the room, but did not sit down right away. She walked straight to the table, opened the laptop, and started copying data from the recorder and thermal camera without saying a word. I made coffee with the old machine in the corner, even though I knew neither of us was calm enough to sleep. Around midnight, Dana finally looked up from the screen. She said the footage should not be released in any form. At first, I thought she was afraid of being mocked, but Dana explained that what worried her was not the internet or the hunting crowd. She said if the video got out, people would go back to that valley to hunt for whatever was in the woods, and people like that usually carried more guns than good sense. I understood her immediately. The mountains of Montana are full of people who believe anything unexplained should be shot first and understood later. I looked at the footage, paused on the frame of the creature standing in the snow, and suddenly thought about how it had only watched us instead of attacking. That thought bothered me in a strange way. Dana kept analyzing the audio until nearly dawn, while I sat replaying the video frame by frame. I tried to find one reasonable detail that could pull me back to normal reality, but the longer I looked, the more I noticed things in the footage I had missed before. In one very short frame, when the thermal camera moved away from the wolves, I saw another heat source farther away, flashing between the tree trunks on the slope. At first, I thought it was an image error caused by snow. I increased the brightness and slowed the video to the lowest speed. The heat mass was still there. It was smaller than the creature we had seen near camp, but it had a similar shape. My heart sank when I understood what that might mean. Dana looked at the screen for several long seconds, then silently turned away. Neither of us wanted to say aloud that there might be more than one individual in that forest. The next morning, Dana left the motel early to return to Bozeman and analyze the hair sample and audio data more carefully. Before she left, she reminded me not to go back to the valley again. I promised her, more as a polite reflex than a real commitment. After Dana drove away, I went to the diner in Livingston and happened to see Walter Grin sitting alone in the corner near the window. He was still wearing the same old flannel shirt from before, except now his boots were covered in dirty snow, as if he had just come back from the mountains. I took my coffee and sat across from him without waiting for an invitation. Walter looked at me for a long time before telling me I looked like a man who had seen a ghost. I did not tell him everything that had happened the night before, but when I mentioned the knocking in the forest and the wolves' reaction, his face clearly darkened. Walter said the Crow people had stories about forest watchers living deep in the crazy mountains. According to him, some parts of the mountains were once considered places where people should not hunt because animals often disappeared from there before winter. Walter did not say those stories were true. He only stressed that many older people in the area avoided certain valleys after dark. I asked whether he believed what I had filmed was one of those beings. Walter sipped his coffee and said the important thing was not what name we gave it. The important thing was understanding that some places out there do not want humans to stay too long. That sentence stayed with me for the rest of the day. That afternoon, while filling up at the gas station outside town, I heard two men talking about a young trapper missing near the north side of the crazy mountains. At first, I did not pay much attention, because hunters getting lost in snowstorms is not rare in Montana. But when I heard them mention the area near the same logging road I had used, my stomach immediately went cold. I drove to the small county sheriff's office to read the missing person notice. The missing man was Owen Pike, 26 years old, a trapper who set traps for foxes and martens in the northern mountains. He had lost contact 3 days earlier. The search team had only found his backpack near a frozen creek and many wolf tracks around the area. I stood looking at Owen's photo on the notice board longer than I needed to. Guilt began pressing heavily into my chest. Part of me thought I should have told the sheriff everything I had seen, but I knew what that would lead to. They would organize a large search, bringing rifles, floodlights, and dozens of curious people deep into the valley. That thought made me more uneasy than silence. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Owen and the footage with the second heat source in the woods. Near dawn, I decided to return to the mountains one last time. I convinced myself that if Owen was still alive somewhere out there, I might find a trace before the big snowstorm moved in. Dana called me around 7 in the morning, but I did not answer. I knew she would stop me from going. I loaded extra fuel, rope, and first aid gear into the truck and left Livingston while the sky was still dim. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped hard overnight. Ice-covered pines shone under the pale gray morning light, making the whole forest look colder than before. The logging road had almost disappeared under the fresh snow. I had to drive very slowly to avoid sliding into the ditch. The farther I went into the mountains, the more isolated everything felt. No other tire tracks, no engine sounds, only wind moving across empty slopes and snow cracking under the tires. I parked the Tacoma near the old camp spot and continued on foot with the thermal camera and a shotgun slung over my back. I did not fool myself into thinking the gun would keep me safe if I met the creature again. Carrying it only made me feel a little less helpless. The forest was so quiet that each step sounded too loud in my ears. After nearly 40 minutes following old search team tracks, I found the body of an elk lying on a low, rocky slope north of the valley. Its belly had been torn open, and the snow around it was full of wolf tracks. But among those chaotic paw prints were much larger tracks pressed over everything. I knelt to inspect them and felt the familiar cold run along my spine. The footprints were exactly like the one I had seen beside the cabin on the first morning, except this time they formed a whole trail cutting through the wolf pack without any sign that the wolves had chased or fought back. That made me understand that the wolves did not see the creature as ordinary prey or a normal rival. They made way for it. I stood up and was about to continue along the rock slope when I heard a very soft sound behind me. Not wind, snow compressing under a heavy weight. I spun around and saw it standing between the pines, less than 25 feet away. For several seconds, my mind went completely blank. In real life, the creature was larger than anything the camera had captured. Black silver fur covered its shoulders and back, clumped into hard patches as if it had moved through cold mud. The skin around its eyes was dark and deep enough that its reflective eyes seemed almost sunken inside shadow. Its breath formed thick clouds in the freezing air. Its long arms hung low beside its body, covered with dry soil and pieces of plants caught in the fur. What froze me was not its appearance, but the way it looked at me. No anger, no panic, just a calm, heavy, unreadable stare that made me feel more like an intruder than a man holding a gun in the forest. I did not dare move. Even breathing became hard. I thought if I raised the shotgun, everything would end right there. But the creature showed no sign that it wanted to charge. It only looked at me for a very long time, so long the whole forest seemed to slow down around us. From far away, wolves suddenly howled fiercely on the other side of the valley. The creature in front of me instantly turned its head toward the sound. The speed of that movement chilled me because it was far too fast for a body that huge. As it turned, I realized the way it moved was not completely human. Its upper body leaned low, while its long legs stepped with heavy weight into the snow, like a giant primate used to rough ground. Within seconds, it rushed into the forest and disappeared between the pines. I only heard branches breaking, one after another, as the sound faded into the valley. It took almost a full minute before I realized I was still standing in place, my hands stiff around the shotgun. My heart pounded so hard my chest hurt. I wanted to return to the truck immediately, but then a black object near the edge of the frozen creek caught my eye. It was Owen Pike's action camera, covered in snow. I picked it up with shaking cold hands and tried to turn it on. Surprisingly, the battery still had a little charge. I crouched behind a rock to watch the final file in its memory. The video shook violently, as if Owen was running. Through the light from his headlamp, I saw wolves appearing between the trees before suddenly fleeing to both sides. Owen turned the camera behind him just as a large shadow moved across the edge of the frame. There were only a few brief frames, but they were enough to show a long, fur-covered arm and a massive shoulder, just like the creature I had faced moments before. The video ended with Owen's heavy breathing and a hard impact that turned the screen black. No human body, no final scream, just a terrifying emptiness after the footage cut off. I sat in the freezing valley with the camera in my hand and understood that I would never see the Montana mountains the same way again. The worst thing was not that something huge lived out there. The worst thing was the feeling that this creature had watched humans long enough to know exactly when to appear and when to disappear, leaving behind only enough evidence to make people doubt their own eyes. When I stood to leave the rocky slope, the wind began to strengthen in the pines, carrying a very distant howl across the snow-covered valley. I did not know whether the sound belonged to wolves or something else in the forest, and for the first time since everything began, I realized I truly did not want to know the answer anymore. I left the crazy mountains that afternoon, with Owen Pike's camera on the passenger seat, and a heavy feeling clinging to me like a dull ache behind my head. The Montana sky was filled with low, lead-colored clouds pressing close to the peaks, and snow started falling thicker as I got near Livingston. I did not turn on the radio. I did not play a podcast like I usually did on long drives. After what had happened in the valley, my mind had no room left for any noise. The image of the creature standing in the forest kept appearing every time I blinked. What haunted me most was not its size or strength. It was that calm stare, as if it was used to humans entering its territory and then running away in panic. When I got back to the motel, I locked the room door more carefully than usual and placed Owen's camera on the table beside the laptop. I hesitated for almost 10 minutes before opening the final footage again. The video still ended at the moment the black shape swept across the frame, but this time I noticed the sound behind Owen's gasping breath. There were 2 very soft wood knocks in a row before the video cut off. The sound was exactly like what I had heard around camp on the night with Dana. I sat staring at the dark screen after the video ended and suddenly wondered whether Owen had understood how long he had been watched before the camera stopped recording. That evening, Dana called me again. This time I answered because I knew she would not give up. Her voice sounded more tired than usual. Dana said the hair analysis did not fully match any species in the database she could access. Some traits were close to primates, but the protein structure was abnormal in a way she had never seen. Dana did not say the rest right away. After a few seconds of silence, she asked if I was still in Montana. I said yes, then told her about finding Owen's camera and the closest encounter I had just had in the forest. The other end of the line stayed silent for a long time before Dana said I should hand all the footage to the sheriff and leave the state as soon as possible. I knew she was right. But in that moment, I realized I no longer believed everything would end just because I drove somewhere else. I slept in broken pieces until near dawn and woke to the sound of truck engines outside the motel. Through the curtain gap, I saw 2 search team pickups parked in front of the office. They were probably preparing to go back into the mountains to look for Owen one more time before the big storm hit. The guilt returned so strongly that I could not sit still. I got dressed and drove to the sheriff's office with Owen's camera. The local sheriff was Carl Dempsey, a man in his 50s, heavy-set, with eyes that looked like they had seen too many accidents in life. I did not tell him everything. I only said I had found the camera near the area the search team was checking. Carl watched the footage several times with an unreadable face. He did not mention the creature in the video. He only asked if I had gone back into that area alone. I nodded, and he sighed very softly before saying that many young men think they understand the forest until the forest reacts back. That sentence reminded me of Walter. It seemed the people who had lived around the crazy mountains for a long time all carried the same caution, one they never fully explained in words. Before leaving the sheriff's office, I asked if they had found any sign of Owen besides the backpack. Carl shook his head. He said the new snow had covered almost all old tracks, and the wolves in the area had been moving strangely all week, making tracking almost useless. When I turned toward the door, Carl suddenly called me back and asked in a very low voice whether I had heard knocking in the forest. I froze for a few seconds before nodding. Carl said nothing else. The look in his eyes was enough for me to understand that this was not the first time something like this had happened around those mountains. I decided to leave Montana the next day. The rational part of me finally won after too many sleepless nights and too much stress. I packed my equipment, copied all the footage onto 2 hard drives, and prepared to drive back toward Idaho before the weather got worse. But around the middle of my final night at the motel, I woke to the sound of wolves howling far outside town. The sound stretched through the snow like a train whistle from somewhere not meant for humans. I lay still, staring at the dark ceiling, and realized I was listening for whether the knocking would come next. The next morning, the sky was clear for the first time after days of snow. The distant mountains stood sharp under cold silver light. I filled the gas tank and left just after 7. As Livingston slowly shrank in the rearview mirror, the tightness in my chest began easing for the first time in almost a week. I thought everything was finally over. But a little over an hour later, when I stopped near a small roadside rest area to drink coffee, I opened my phone to check email and saw a message from Dana sent near dawn. She had attached an audio spectrum image from the recorder on the night at camp. Among the chaotic frequency bands, there was one repeating section with a structure almost like primate communication signals. Dana did not make any conclusion, but she wrote that she had never seen an animal sound with such deliberate rhythm. I sat in the truck reading that message again and again for a long time. Outside the window, wind blew snow dust across the empty parking lot. In that moment, I understood the thing haunting me was not only fear. It was the feeling that I had accidentally looked into a part of nature modern humans always pretend no longer exists. Something ancient, difficult to understand, and smart enough to avoid every light, camera, and scientific story we build around nature. I kept driving south and did not stop until late afternoon in Idaho Falls. The city was full of lights and traffic, and it made me feel as if I had returned from a place outside of time. I ate dinner in a crowded steakhouse, but barely tasted the food. Each time the restaurant door opened and cold air rushed in, I remembered the smell of wet soil and animal fur in the valley. That night I slept deeply for the first time in days, but I dreamed of wolves standing motionless in a snowy forest, all staring in the same direction. When I woke, I could not clearly remember what I had seen in the darkness ahead of them. I only remembered the feeling that the entire forest was waiting for something to step out. A few weeks after I returned home, Dana sent me a short email. The search team had stopped looking for Owen Pike after the winter storm covered the whole northern Crazy Mountains area. They had found no further signs besides the camera and backpack. Dana also said she had deleted the footage copy from her research computer. I understood that decision. Even so, I still kept 2 hard drives containing all the videos locked in a drawer under my desk. Sometimes I opened the footage just to remind myself that what happened in Montana was not a group panic or a memory twisted by fear. The wolves in the video were real. The footprints in the snow were real. And the thing standing in the forest, looking straight into my camera, existed in some way, even if I can no longer explain it with familiar logic. The strangest thing is that over time, the fear I first felt slowly turned into a kind of respect I cannot fully describe. I do not think that creature hunted humans the way many online stories like to describe. If it had wanted to, it had many chances on the night we were at camp. Instead, the more I think about it, the more I believe it only wanted us to leave the place that belonged to it. A few months later, I received an unsigned postcard at my company mailbox. The front showed a black and white photo of the Crazy Mountains covered in snow. On the back, there was only one rough handwritten line. Some places in nature are still wilder than humans think. I do not know whether that postcard came from Walter, someone on the search team, or just a joke from someone who knew the story. But since that day, I have never gone back to Montana. Sometimes during shoots in Oregon or Washington, I still see wolves far away in the forest. Every time, I remember the moment that whole pack backed away from the darkness in the snow-covered valley. Animals understand nature in a more direct way than we do. They know when to fight, when to run, and when a forest no longer belongs to them. I think humans had that instinct too, a very long time ago, before electric lights and highways made us believe every wilderness had already been explained. Even now, I will not claim I know what I saw in the Crazy Mountains. Maybe there is an unrecorded primate species out there. Maybe it was the last remaining piece of something older than every story we tell around campfires. The only thing I know for sure is that on the night the wolves fled through Montana snow, I saw real fear in the eyes of predators that stood near the top of the food chain. And when something appears in the deep woods and makes all of nature fall silent around it, a human being's first instinct is sometimes not curiosity. Sometimes it is understanding that you should turn around and leave before the darkness decides to take one more step forward. Hello everyone, I am Mike, the host of Bigfoot Story Hidden, where we listen to stories that lie on the boundary between what humans believe to be true and what we are not yet ready to accept. Tonight, while recording this story, I kept thinking about one very small detail in the whole Montana experience. Not the howl in the snow-covered valley, not the giant black shape standing among the wolves. The thing that stayed with me the longest was the moment the entire forest suddenly went silent before that creature appeared. If you have ever gone deep into the pine forests of Northern America, you understand that nature is rarely completely quiet. There is always wind moving through branches, the sound of water somewhere far away, or the tiny noises of animals moving in the dark. But in many Bigfoot stories around Montana, Idaho, and the Pacific Northwest, people often mention the same strange feeling. The forest seems to hold its breath for a few seconds before something steps out from the trees. I do not know what that means. Maybe it is only a psychological reaction when humans sense danger before seeing its source. Or maybe nature recognizes certain things much earlier than we do. The real Crazy Mountains are one of the most isolated mountain regions in Montana. The Crow people have considered that place sacred for generations and avoided going too deep into certain areas after dark. Modern biologists know the region is also a movement corridor for gray wolves, mountain lions, and grizzly bears during the cold season. What interests me is that predators often react strongly to unusual changes in their environment. When an entire wolf pack retreats from something inside its familiar hunting ground, I think their instincts deserve more attention than human laughter. I also think many viewers may wonder why the character in this story did not release all the footage immediately. Honestly, if one day you truly encountered something that did not fit your familiar logic deep in the forest, your first reaction would usually not be to prove it to the internet. Your first reaction would be to understand what just happened and ask yourself whether you should ever return to that place again. That is what makes stories like this haunt me after so many years. They are not only about mysterious creatures, they are about the moment modern humans suddenly realize there are still corners of the world that do not care whether we believe in them or not. And sometimes, the scariest thing is not being hunted. The scariest thing is the feeling that something has been watching us for a very long time while we never even realized it was there. If you have ever camped in Montana, Wyoming, or the deep northern forests of America, and experienced a moment when the whole forest suddenly went strangely silent, I truly want to know what that felt like for you. Maybe it was only the wind changing, maybe it was a predator passing through, or maybe there are still a few things out there that have not fully vanished from the last wild places of North America. Thank you for staying with me tonight. If this story made you think, leave a comment and share what you believe may exist in those deep forests. And if you have your own strange experience, you can always send that story to Bigfoot Story Hidden. I am Mike, and I will see you in the next story.